Hey guys, I hope everyone's doing well. This is going to be a short video talking about your next assignment. For your last exercise, you did a wet into wet painting. And for this idea, we're going to build upon what you just learned about. And we're going to do wet into wet painting on the background, but then do an object or imaginative piece on top of that. This is two pieces that I finished, and that's exactly what I did. So for the background, which has a more sort of hazy, blurry look to it that you can see, I did wet into wet. So I let it sort of bleed out on the page. And then I left an area in the middle that's negative space that wasn't painted. And then I worked these mask icons on top of that using more traditional techniques for my watercolor painting. So we're going to start out today. We're going to have a drawing I'm going to show you about. I'm going to switch camera views in a second here. And then we're going to start with the watercolor. First, you may want to draw out your icon or your negative space shape. That can be a still life or, as I said, anything that comes up off the top of your head, either improvised or planned out. It's up to you. All right, let's do some painting. So for my painting idea, I started out with a few thumbnail sketches. The idea that I have is that I want to work with the wings. And I was sort of inspired by bats and moths and all sorts of different creatures that I looked at. So the first thing that I'm going to do is map out the area that I want to be affected by the wet onto wet painting, which is outside of my wings here on my watercolor paper. And I'm going to do my very best to leave the wings in the middle unaffected by that, so that then later I can go in with more of a dry brush technique and fill those wings in. Okay, so I've taped the edge of my paper down, as you can see. That's going to prevent buckling on the paper once it gets wet. A lot of you probably discovered that that happens pretty easily. And we're going to, just like last time, wet the paper with a nice dose of clear, uncontaminated water. And then after that, we're going to start to dab the paints in and then see what happens. Okay, so just like last week, very similar step. We're painting water onto the canvas. And the only difference is that this time I'm sort of being more careful about where I put the water. And I'm trying to work around my pencil line. I'm not sure how visible that pencil line is on the video. What this does is it creates a barrier from the dry paper to the wet paper. It's kind of hard to get it exact, and in fact I'm not really going to worry about it being that exact, because I'm going to go in with a black line, maybe an India ink or something like that. And after I'm done with every part of the painting, I'm going to add black lines on that. And those lines are going to give me some definition. So I can already tell that I'm not going exactly up against the line. Sort of like paint by numbers, I guess. Some of my water is spilling over that edge. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm just going to let it be what it is. And like I said, I can clean a lot of that up later. But the idea is to be somewhat precise. And then just to let there be an area that's dry. Now, somebody pointed out in an email or in the comments, keeping the paper wet is sometimes the hardest part. The paper, because it's watercolor paper, absorbs the water fairly quickly, and it can dry pretty quickly as well. So you got to work, you know, pretty fast. All right, we're going to try a little red, mixing in just a little bit of yellow ochre here. And we should see some of that same magic that we saw last week. I got my brush loaded with red and yellow ochre. And I'm just going to spread that out. I'll start out with sort of a light touch. As with so many things with painting, there's not a right or wrong way to do it. It's just however you decide that you want your piece to look. We're getting some nice bleeding going on here. Starting to feel a little bit more confident about the way it's going to look, so I'm adding a little bit more paint onto my brush. We're going darker with that. And you can sort of play with it while it's wet. Spread it out a little bit. Going up against that line. Because we only wet the outside of my wings, it should work with you a little bit and create a little barrier and prevent that paint from going over. And like I said, if it does a little bit, don't worry about it. That's the nature of watercolor. There's a lot of chance when you're working with watercolor. Not everything is planned out, right? You guys have figured that out. You're almost 16 weeks into the semester. Let's try a little bit more red and get a little more bold with it. Yeah, now we're got something going here. My paper's starting to buckle. I don't know if you can tell that in the video, but I'm not worried. I'm not too worried about it because I taped those edges down. If it's a piece that you really want to care about and maybe someday you're going to frame it, I do highly recommend taping the edges down with simple masking tape or painter's tape. So even when the paper does buckle, when it dries, it will go back into its predetermined flat shape. Trying to get that little spot in between the wings. A bit of a trouble area. Also kind of like the way that the masking tape creates a nice sharp line. It's always nice when you pull that tape off the edge and you get that really sharp framing device. So now I'm really going in with my deep reds. And again, if I was just painting onto dry paper with my watercolor paint, I wouldn't be getting these nice fluid, bleeding, cloudy, however you want to describe it, shapes. So it helps it come alive a little bit. Almost would describe it as an airbrushed effect, perhaps, where it just gives you those nice edges. Sometimes I'll just take a little water. Always a little bit more careful around the edge of my shape. But again, I'm not going to stress too much because I'm going to go in, as you'll see later on, I'm going to go in and add some black, probably Faber-Castell India ink brush pen, which is my my choice of drawing utensil. I'm not getting paid for that. I just really like their brush pens, which you can use Sharpie or anything else. Micron makes a pen as well. Or if you've got a really steady hand, you can go in with your brush and do it that way. I like brush pens because they give me a sort of a medium between a brush and a drawing. I grew up drawing more than I did painting, so I think I always come back to drawing first and foremost. So it's bled really nicely. It's giving me a nice uniform wet into wet effect. You could go in and experiment a little bit. If you don't want it to look quite so uniform, you can go in with your brush. And just like last week, you can add in, put a lot of paint on your brush, dab that in. If you want to get really experimental, you can use salt, which will create interesting, unique textures and patterns. I'm just going to pull some of that in. You don't even have to just use a single color either. I could use purples and blues and all sorts of interesting, fun colors if I felt like it. But I'm in a big red phase right now. I really like red. Working in red with a lot of my artwork. So I'm about at the point where I'm going to call this done. I'm working outside, so I'm going to go put this in the sun, let the sun do its thing, and we'll see how it looks once it's at a dried part. Okay guys, I'm back. I have let my watercolor paper dry overnight, so it's completely dry to the touch. And I'm pretty happy with the way that the background turned out. I'm now going to go in and add some blue watercolor into my wing area. And again, I'm going to try to go up against the line. I'm not going to worry too much about it because I'm going to be adding in some black lines to sort of cover the whole thing up and give it some solid shape. There we go. You can add in as many colors as you want, make it as complicated as you want. For this project, I want you to follow the same process, but you don't necessarily have to just use something out of your imagination like I'm doing. Feel free to also work with a still life, set up something in your house or your apartment, go from there. Now I'm not doing wet onto wet at this point. At this point the paper is just completely dry, and I'm just working with the more traditional technique of taking my paint and brushing it on to the paper, and no wet onto wet technique at this point at all. And what I'm going to do is probably let this dry, maybe add another layer of blue on there to get a little bit of a richer, darker color. And then the ink lines are going to go on top of that. I thought about adding in, like the paintings I showed you at the beginning of this video, maybe adding in some other areas of green, orange, but I think for the sake of keeping this video relatively short, keeping it to being just a demonstration, nothing too complicated, I'm going to keep this thing nice, short, and sweet, and I'm only going to use my favorite colors, which are red and then blue. So if you want to play around with that, have fun with it. We'll check back when I'm ready to add in some darker lines. You can still play around with adding water drops in, playing around with wet, a little bit of mini wet onto wet technique if you'd like to do that. Okay, we'll check back when this is ready to dry and see what we've got going on then. All right guys, I'm back. My paper's completely dry. Several hours of letting it sit did the job for me. The next step for me, which I mentioned earlier, is to add brush pen lines around the outer edge and perhaps maybe some on the inside as well. I'm going to improvise that part a little bit. So what is a brush pen? This is an example of one that I use a lot, both in my sculptures and masks, and also in painting. And this is a Faber-Castell is the brand. It has a B on the end. Sometimes it's hard to tell when you buy these because they're fine point tips. But make sure you look for the B. This is another brand that I'll use, Pigma brush. Very, very similar. Has a little bit of a sharper edge to it. But it is a lot like painting, except it gives you a little bit more control just because it has a finer tip on it. And I like the really rich black that I can get with the brush pen. But you know, if you have that, that's great. Experiment with the Sharpie as well, or really any ink pen at all will work just great on top of your watercolor surface here. So I'm going to add my lines around the edge, and I'm going to start by just kind of working my way around the edge. I'm going to create a double line, which is going to give me an area to fill in, sort of paint by numbers. So that's one line. I have a second line that goes around the edge here. And I'm going to go back in and fill that line in with just a regular brush with black paint. So essentially what I'm doing, it's a little bit of extra work, but I'm giving myself a really sharp, clean line that I probably would not be able to do with a brush if I'm just using a brush tip like this. I don't think I could get a line that's that smooth. And I'm going to go around and do the entire outer edge. I'm also cleaning up where I was a little bit messy when I painted in that blue earlier. A little bit too messy for my preference. And you can kind of see my technique. I sort of work my way into a smooth line and correct myself a little bit as I go. I actually really like this part of the process. It's soothing to just kind of fill those lines in. Get those lines exactly the way you want them. Now I'm not going to let you or make you sit here and watch me go all the way around the edge. So I'm going to pause the video and go ahead and add my lines in. Probably add some lines in the interior of the blue part all the way around the edge. And then we'll check back and I'll let you see the finished product. All right, thanks. And here's the final piece. I finished adding in the India ink brush pen lines and filled in the black paint. So I want you for this project to find a way to draw on top of your watercolor piece. Like I said, you're welcome to use a Sharpie if you don't have any brush pens available, or really any kind of pen you want at all. I'm going to show you one more piece that I've done. Kind of occurred to me to show a different technique. So I used wet into wet for the background of this painting, and then I used a fine tip India ink brush pen for this one as well. So you can kind of see same technique where it's watercolor, but also I drew on top. The India ink always is the last step for your painting. So hopefully that'll give you some inspiration. If you want to work with this technique instead of the broader strokes that you get with a Sharpie, then by all means have fun with that. Look forward to seeing what everybody comes up with. Thanks for your time.